everybody, I'm Michelle Roy of Dragonfly Wellness, and this is part 2 of our series on mindful eating. Today's part is called Chew. So this is all about the role that chewing plays in mindful eating, and believe it or not, it's a very important role. And we're also going to wrap it around to what an important role it plays in breathing, which of course is a huge part of mindfulness and yogic practices. So it all ties in with our wellness here. So I'm gonna start, this is like nerd level information on chewing and the anatomy of the skull and the jaw. So we're not gonna get too in depth, but that's the starting place, and it's fascinating to see where these changes have come in our anthropological history as humans. So we're going to start with some excerpts from the book Breath. I think I've shared with you, I was evangelizing about this book for about 2 years after I read it. I still do. I highly recommend it to anyone who has even a remote interest in breathing and breathing practices. It's a wonderful, wonderful book by James Nestor. So he has an entire chapter in this book on chewing and the critical role it plays in our breathing capacity and health. So I'm going to start with a little quote here. So he's talking about how, okay, so let me just back up a moment. In this chapter, he covers how we shifted from a hunter-gatherer society towards an agricultural society, and what happened in that shift where we went away from hunting and gathering and eating in a fashion that supports that lifestyle to one that you see more in line with agricultural communities. So 12,000 years ago, we're hunter-gatherers up to about, and then so you start to see this gradual shift in the jaw structure and the skull structure beginning back then as agricultural communities began to pop up here and there. And then there was a rapid shift across all the agricultural cultures. 300 years ago, 1700s, this shift in the jaw is positively viral. We see mouths shrinking, faces are flatter, sinuses become clogged. We also see crooked teeth and jaws. And this is all attributed to eating softer processed foods and doing less chewing. All right, now here's the thing I want to share with you. He used himself as an example, and he went through an experiment to, he went through some dental procedures he was wearing like a retainer and another specific device to widen his jaw, and also was doing some specific chewing practices. He says, the results were stunning. I had gained 1,658 cubic millimeters of new bone in my cheeks and right eye socket, the equivalent volume of 5 pennies. He also added bone along his nose and upper jaw. His jaw position became better aligned and balanced. Airways widened and became firmer. This is a little graphic, but he goes on to say the deposit of pus and granulation that had accumulated in my maxillary sinuses, likely the result of mild chronic obstruction, was completely gone. He does make this footnote. No one needs a homeoblock or retainer. That's that specific dental device I was talking about. You don't need those devices to get the bone building and airway expanding benefits of chewing. Hard natural foods and chewing gum likely work just as effectively. There's a woman named Mariana Evans who recommends her patients chew gum for a couple of hours a day. He followed this advice and said some days he would chomp on an extremely hard type of Turkish gum called thalim, which came in flavors like carbonate and mint grass. He said it tasted pretty crude, but it offered a workout and delivered results. So a note about chewing gum. I'm going to make a note about chewing gum though. So any kind of chewing, ideally that chewing is coming in the form of more fibrous foods and less processed foods, because obviously soft processed foods don't require a lot of chewing. So ideally we're getting our chewing work in from fibrous foods. However, if you want to give your jaw a little bit more to do, then you can use chewing gum. And my only recommendation to that is to do it when you have food in your tummy. Learned many years ago that we can develop a toxicity from chewing gum on an empty stomach, because as soon as you start to chew the gum, we increase saliva production in the mouth, which is the first indication of digestion. That sends a message to the stomach to start creating stomach acid so it can prepare for digesting food. However, if you're chewing the gum and then not putting anything in your stomach, then you're creating all this acid and it doesn't have anything to do to digest. So my recommendation, as I learned from this person many years ago, is to just chew the gum after meals or when your tummy already has something to digest. And then of course, if you deal with TMJ type things, they always kind of, discourage gum chewing. However, it does help to chew, but the best way to do it is through fibrous foods, which is a great segue into our next book, Consider the Fork. This is by B. Wilson. This book is wonderful. It's a wonderful anthropological study of cooking and our history of cooking and the technology that goes along with that, such as pots and pans and knives and all sorts of things. And she even gets into the value of chewing as well. So here are a couple of factoids I'm going to share with you from B's book. She says, kitchen tools have changed us in more physical ways. There is good evidence to suggest that the current obesity crisis is caused in part not by what we eat, although this is part of it as well, but by the degree to which our food has been processed before we eat it. This is sometimes referred to as calorie delusion. In 2003, scientists at Kyushu University in Japan fed one group of rats hard food pellets and another group softer pellets. In every other respect, the pellets were identical, the same nutrients, the same calories. After 22 weeks, the rats on the soft food diet had become obese, showing that texture is an important factor in weight gain. Further studies involving pythons eating ground cooked steak versus intact raw steak confirmed these findings. Here's the takeaway. When we eat chewier, less processed foods, it takes us more energy to digest them, so the number of calories our body receives is less. So when we're doing the chewing, we're using up some of those calories just in the act of chewing, which is why that is so critical to our digestion. And obviously we know chewing chewing our food thoroughly helps to support our full digestion of that. Sorry, I'll get that out. Okay, now here's more evidence to support what James Nestor says in his book about the evolution of kitchen implements and how this processed food shifted the jaw. So here, she gets into the work of Professor Charles Loring Brace, who was born in 1930 and in the 60s really started to study the overbite. The Stone Age mastery of cutting tools seems to have been one of the factors leading to the smaller jaws and teeth of modern man as compared with our hominid ancestors. But it was only 200 to 250 years ago, with the adoption of the knife and fork at the dining table, that the overbite emerged. Brace's data suggests that this revolution in table manners had an immediate impact on teeth. He has argued that the incisors, from the Latin incidere, to cut, are misnamed. Their real purpose is not to cut, but to clamp food in the mouth, as in the stuff and cut method of eating. So think back to hunter-gatherer times, right? Putting the food in the mouth and tearing it to eat. It is my suspicion, he wrote, that if the incisors are used in such a manner several times a day, from the time that they first begin to erupt, that they will become positioned so that they normally occlude edge to edge. Once people start cutting their food up in very small pieces using a knife and fork and popping the morsels into their mouths, the clamping function of the incisors ceases, and the incisors continue to erupt until the top layer no longer meets the bottom layer, creating an overbite. So he continues, because he's asking, what about China? Because stuff and cut is entirely alien to the Chinese way of eating. Cutting with a tu, which is a large knife, chopping knife, and eating with chopsticks. The Chinese culture believes that knives don't have a place at the table, they belong in the kitchen. So they cut the food very small so that it can be ingested with chopsticks. So his theory was that we should have seen this shift in the overbite of the jaws in the Chinese population before we see it in Europe. So he finally discovers some evidence of this by finding a body from the Song dynasty, which is when that style of eating became prevalent. And he says, over subsequent years, Brace has analyzed many Chinese teeth and found that, with the exception of peasants, who often retain an edge-to-edge bite well into the 20th century, the overbite does indeed emerge 800 to 1,000 years earlier in China than in Europe. The differing attitude to knives in the East and West had a graphic impact on the alignment of our jaws. All right, so that's the nerd level anthropology of chewing processed foods, smaller bites, versus using our teeth and jaws as we did back in our hunter-gatherer days. So again, the message is just to chew as much as possible. And guess what? Thich Nhat Hanh, when he talks about mindful eating, also discusses mindful chewing. He says, mindful eating is an important practice. It nourishes awareness in us. In Buddhist monasteries, we eat our meals in silence to make it easier to give our full attention to the food and to the other members of the community who are present. We chew each morsel of food thoroughly, he says, at least 30 times to help us to be truly in touch with it. Eating this way is also very good for digestion. So to tie this back to our mindful eating practices, we're going to end with Thich Nhat Hanh's information there. So we learn from breath and consider the fork that chewing has a strong physical impact for us. It has a strong impact on our digestion. To add the aspect of mindfulness means that as we are chewing this food, we're tasting the flavors. We're appreciating the different combinations of flavors from the various foods that I have on my plate. So yes, I may still be eating with a knife and a fork, but as I fork up a small bite of food, yes, it is a small bite, but I still apply this same mindful chewing. Count your chews. It's amazing to see how little we chew our food before we swallow. This is one of the things I did when I was on retreat and I was really into this mindful eating and the chewing and all of that and paying attention. And I realized at best, I chew my food 7 to 10 times before I swallow. Obviously that's changed now because I've really been applying these practices while I'm eating my meals. But often, here's the other thing I noticed as I was observing other people, not that I was watching other people eat, but I could literally hear it. Most of us have a tendency to we've already cut and arranged our next bite while we're still chewing. Sometimes we don't even finish chewing what we have in our mouths before we put the next bite in. So it's really important as we're doing this mindful eating and as we're doing mindful chewing to finish chewing and swallow that bite. Maybe even pause for a moment, just a heartbeat or two, before you take the next bite in. And then chew that one just as carefully before you swallow. Try this, count your chews. It's amazing. There are only super chewy foods that I can get up to 30 chews on most of the time. Again, if it's a smaller bite too, you're not going to get that far with that, right? But even if it's a smaller bite, see how long you can go with the chewing. And you'll find that your digestion it occurs much more easily, and you have a much more enjoyable experience eating your food. Also, we recognize when we get full, right? When we're eating more slowly, when we're chewing thoroughly, that we get the message, the body gets the message sooner, like I'm full, I've had enough. And then we can stop. If you happen to be, Thich Nhat Hanh says that the most important things that we focus on during our meals is the food itself and our companions. So if you are sharing a meal with other people and you're engaging in conversation, that's fine. Take smaller bites. And then when someone inevitably asks you something while you have a bite in your mouth, finish chewing and swallow before you answer them. Don't stuff it up in the corner of your mouth. I'm guilty of this too, to answer them. Right? You're ingesting a lot of air when you do that. You're rushing your bites. You're rushing the chewing process. Finish chewing and swallow. If you're eating by yourself, again, count those chews and see how it goes for you. See how long and mindful you can make your meals. When you have time, obviously we don't have time at every single meal, but when you have time, take the time. Don't be on your device or reading other things while you're eating. Focus on the chewing. Focus on the flavors. Be really present with each bite that you arrange from your plate and enjoy that thoroughly before you swallow. And your body will love you for it. And all that chewing will help you breathe more deeply and effectively as well. All right, everybody, that's part 2 called Chew. So we will see you again next week with part 3 of mindful eating. Have a great day, everybody.